Some people walk into a room and the whole place shifts, not because they demand it, but because something in them simply refuses to be small. Nobody at the Meridian Culinary Institute noticed that about Claudette Beaumont. Not at first. Not ever, really, until the night they had no choice. She came in through the service entrance every morning at 5:45, the same way she'd done for 11 years. Gray uniform, non-slip shoes, a thermos of black coffee she'd brewed at home because the staff room coffee tasted like burnt newspaper. She'd nod at the security guard, a young Somali man named Fareed who always held the door, and she'd disappear into the building the way a stone disappears into deep water, quietly, without a ripple. Meridian was one of those places that liked to remind you of its own importance. Framed photographs of graduates who'd gone on to open restaurants in Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal. Glass cases holding culinary awards, a lobby that smelled of lemon wax and ambition. The kind of school where the instructors wore their credentials like armor, and the students arrived already certain they were destined for something extraordinary. Claudette cleaned it all. The demonstration kitchens, the lecture halls, the trophy cases. She mopped floors that she'd once, in another life, stood on the other side of. She never mentioned that. There was no reason to. The trouble had a name. Chef Instructor, Brendan Kowalski. He was 34 years old, which at Meridian made him something of a prodigy. He'd trained in Lyon for 2 years, staged at a 2-Michelin-star restaurant in Copenhagen, and returned to Canada with the particular confidence of a man who'd been told he was exceptional so many times he'd stopped questioning it. He taught advanced technique and pastry arts. His students were afraid of him in the way that sometimes gets mistaken for respect. Kowalski had a way of moving through the school like he owned it, which, in his mind, he probably did. He'd pass Claudette in the corridor without looking at her. Not unkindly, exactly. More the way you don't look at a wall. She was furniture to him. Useful, present, not worth registering. The first time he actually spoke to her was a Tuesday in October. Claudette was pushing her cart past Kitchen 4, the main demonstration space, all stainless steel and overhead lighting designed to make everything look like surgery, when the door swung open and Kowalski stepped out, nearly walking into her. He looked at her cart, then at her, then at the floor just behind her cart, where a faint smear of something remained near the baseboard. "You missed a spot," he said. Claudette looked at the smear, looked back at him. "I'll get it on the way back. I'd prefer you get it now. We have a visiting assessor coming through this afternoon, and I don't want this place looking like a Tim Hortons." She went back and cleaned the smear. He watched for a moment, nodded once, as though she'd performed correctly, and walked away. That was the beginning. After that, Kowalski seemed to find her wherever she was, not deliberately, or at least Claudette never believed it was deliberate. It was more that once he'd decided she existed in a particular category, he applied the category consistently. The category was lesser, Claudette. He'd learned her name from her ID badge. He used it the way people use a word they find slightly distasteful but necessary. The third-floor washroom. There's a situation. Claudette. Someone tracked flour from Patisserie Lab across the east corridor. "Could you? Claudette. I'm about to start a 3-hour demonstration, and I need these counters properly sanitized. Not just wiped. There's a difference. I don't know if that's something you." He'd paused. "Just make sure it's done properly." She always did it properly. She'd been doing it properly for 11 years. She didn't say this. She simply went and did the work, which she did as she'd always done it, thoroughly, without complaint, without rushing, and without any of the resentment that Kowalski aides seemed to be waiting for her to display so he could feel justified in something. The other custodial staff noticed. Paulette, who'd worked at Meridian for 7 years, and was the kind of woman who noticed everything and forgot nothing, pulled Claudette aside one morning in November. "That man has had it out for you since October," Paulette said. "You know that, right?" "He has it out for everyone," Claudette said. "Some people are just built that way. Some people are built to be put in their place." Claudette smiled, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach the surface. "That's not something I need to see happen." Paulette looked at her for a long moment. There was something in Claudette's voice. Not resignation, not defeat. Something older and quieter than that. Paulette couldn't name it. She filed it away. What nobody at Meridian knew, what nobody had any reason to know, was that Claudette Beaumont had once been Chef Claudette Beaumont, and that those two words, Chef and Claudette, had appeared in En Route magazine, in the Globe and Mail, in the kind of places that mattered to the kind of people who read them. She'd had a restaurant. It was called Beau Rivage, which was her grandmother's name for the lake where she'd grown up outside Sudbury, a wide, quiet lake that looked silver in the morning and dark gold at night. The restaurant had been in a converted house in the annex neighborhood of Toronto, 12 tables, a menu that changed entirely every 6 weeks, a kitchen where Claudette ran a staff of 8 with the same quality she brought to everything, quietly, completely, without excess. She'd earned it over 20 years, apprenticing under a Haitian-Canadian chef named Gérard Moreau, who'd told her on her first day that cooking was not about showing off what you knew, but about making the person eating feel understood. She'd taken that seriously. She'd worked stations in Montreal and Calgary. She'd spent a year cooking in Martinique, learning her grandmother's food, the real food, the food that didn't make it into magazines. She'd built Beau Rivage from nothing, from a leased building with a problematic plumbing system and a neighborhood that wasn't sure about her, into something that had people waiting 4 months for a reservation. Then her husband died. Marcus. She still thought his name in full, always, as though shortening it would diminish something. Was killed by a driver who ran a red light on a February evening while Marcus was coming home from his evening run. He was 41. He had no warning, neither did she. Claudette closed the restaurant 8 months later. It wasn't a decision she made so much as something that happened, the way a tide goes out. She couldn't explain it to people who asked, and eventually people stopped asking. She moved to Guelph, where Marcus's sister lived. She found the job at Meridian because it was close, and it was quiet, and it required her hands to do things her mind didn't have to participate in, which was, for a time, exactly what she needed. That had been 11 years ago. She was 53 now. She had no intention of going back to any of it. She had a garden behind her apartment. She had Farid's polite good morning and Paulette's company at lunch, and the particular satisfaction of a floor she'd cleaned correctly. That was enough. That had been enough, until the Thursday evening in March, when Brendan Kowalski decided it wasn't. It was the end-of-term showcase, the event Meridian put on every spring where senior students cooked for an invited audience of restaurateurs, food writers, and industry people. The kind of evening that felt high stakes because it was. Careers had started here. Careers had also stalled here, in ways the students wouldn't understand for years. Claudette was working late, finishing the cleaning rotation before the event started. The demonstration kitchen had been in use all day, and there was a particular kind of wreckage that came from 8 students simultaneously trying to produce their best work under pressure. She was working through it methodically when the kitchen door opened, and Kowalski came in, still in his chef's whites, with 2 of his senior students behind him, a young man named Ethan and a young woman named Priya, both of them watching their instructor with the particular attention of people who'd learned to read his moods. Kowalski stopped in the middle of the kitchen and looked around. His expression was the expression of a man who'd found an unreturned library book that he'd suspected existed all along. Claudette. He said her name without looking at her. "We have guests arriving in 40 minutes. What exactly have you been doing in here?" "Cleaning," she said. "I'm not finished yet. You've been here, what, 2 hours? Hour and a half. There was significant prep residue." He made a sound. She wasn't sure how to categorize it. Somewhere between a sigh and a scoff. "Priya, make a note. Custodial timing needs to be addressed for next term." Priya wrote something. She glanced at Claudette with an expression that managed to be apologetic and obedient at the same time. "The prep surfaces still look like someone held a cooking competition in here," Kowalski said, which was, Claudette thought, an accurate description of what had happened. "My guests cannot walk into this." "They won't," Claudette said. "I'll have it done." "That's what you said an hour ago, presumably." She hadn't said anything an hour ago. She'd been alone in the kitchen. But she understood that this conversation wasn't about the truth of what had been said. It was about something else. It was about the ongoing project of making her feel that the space between where she was and where he was could not be crossed. She went back to the counter and continued working. "You know," Kowalski said, and she heard something shift in his voice, the way a man's voice shifts when he's decided to be amusing. "I actually feel a bit bad. Year after year you clean these kitchens. You must have picked something up by now. Maybe you could show me what you'd do differently with the beurre blanc situation." The two students went very still. "The what?" Claudette said. "There's a student who keeps breaking her beurre blanc." He gestured toward the cooktop. "It's a simple sauce, classical foundation, but something in the technique isn't landing and I'm at a loss, frankly. Maybe fresh eyes." He smiled the way men smile when they're confident the smile will never be returned. "Go on, show us how it's done, unless what?" Claudette said. Something in her voice made Ethan take a small step back. He couldn't have said why. It was the way the air in the room changed, maybe. The way Claudette had stopped moving and simply stood there, her hands loose at her sides, her face perfectly, absolutely calm. Kowalski heard it too. He recovered quickly. "Unless you'd rather stick to what you know," he said. The silence lasted maybe 4 seconds. To Ethan, who recalled this evening for years afterward, it felt considerably longer. "Clarified butter," Claudette said. Kowalski blinked. "Sorry? Do you want me to make the clarified butter myself? Or is there some already reduced?" She was looking at the cooktop now, not at him. Her voice had lost whatever edge had been in it a moment ago. She sounded like someone asking a practical question, which she was. And is the student consistently breaking at the emulsification stage, or is she losing it during the acid reduction? Kowalski stared at her. "Because those are two different problems," Claudette said, moving toward the cooktop with the unhurried certainty of someone navigating a room they know by memory. "If she's breaking it at emulsification, that's usually a heat issue. She's letting it get too hot before the butter goes in. If she's losing it during the reduction, it's likely the ratio. Too much vinegar, or she's reducing too fast and the base becomes too acidic to hold." She'd already pulled a saucepan from the rack. She was checking the butter situation in the mise-en place without asking. Her movements were, there was no other word for it, Priya thought later, professional. The kind of professional that is not a style but a state. A body that knows what it's doing so completely that the knowledge has moved out of the mind and into the hands. "There's some shallot reduction already here," Claudette said. "Should I work from this, or do you want me to start from scratch so she can see the whole process?" Nobody said anything. Claudette looked up. She met Kowalski's eyes with an expression that was not triumphant, not defiant, not even particularly pointed. It was simply direct, the look of someone who's waited for a long time for the right moment and is not especially interested in making a production of it. "Scratch," Priya said, before Kowalski could speak. "Please." What happened in the next 22 minutes was not a performance. That was the thing that Ethan and Priya would keep returning to when they talked about it afterward. And they talked about it a great deal. It wasn't showy. There was no dramatic reveal, no moment where Claudette turned and announced herself. She simply cooked. She started the shallot reduction and talked through it as she went. Not lecturing, just explaining. The way someone explains a route they know so well. They're surprised anyone else finds it confusing. She talked about temperature as a relationship between the pan, the fat, and the acid, rather than as a setting on a dial. She talked about what a properly reduced should smell like, should look like, should feel like when you tilt the pan. She made the clarified butter by feel and by eye, not because she was showing off, but because that was how she'd always done it. The butter went in cold, a piece at a time, and she kept the pan moving in a way that looked casual and was anything but. The mistake most people make, she said, is treating the emulsification as the goal. But the emulsification is just the result. You're building a relationship between the acid and the fat. You have to stay present to it. If you stop paying attention for 30 seconds, it knows. Priya was writing. She'd started writing without deciding to. Here. Claudette tilted the pan and let the sauce run to one side. It was smooth, pale gold, glossy, holding together the way such things are supposed to hold together. She lifted a small spoon and offered it to Priya. Priya tasted it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's the best beurre blanc I've ever had." Kowalski said nothing. He was standing near the door of the kitchen, and Claudette had not looked at him since the sauce began. He had a look on his face that she'd seen before, on other faces, in other rooms. The look of a man recalibrating something he'd been certain of. Claudette set down the spoon. She picked up her cloth and went back to the counter she'd been cleaning. "You'll want to tell your student," she said to the room in general, "that the heat should drop by 1/3 when the butter starts going in. That's usually where it falls apart." Kowalski said her name. "Claudette." She looked at him. "Where did you?" He stopped. Started again. "Did you train somewhere?" "Yes," she said. She turned back to the counter. She finished the section she'd been working on, moved to the next, and continued cleaning. He waited. She didn't add anything. "Where?" he said finally. She glanced at him over her shoulder. Not unkindly, not triumphantly, with the calm of someone who has long since made peace with the answer to that question and its implications. "Does it matter?" she said. She didn't mean it as a challenge. She genuinely wanted to know. He didn't answer. She went back to work. Ethan looked it up that night. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. A name, a credential, a face that matched the face in the kitchen. He tried combinations. Black female chef, Toronto, closed restaurant, annex. He found her on the 3rd page of results, in a 2009 archive of an en route piece about restaurants that deserved more attention than they were getting. Chef Claudette Beaumont's Beau Rivage is the kind of place that makes you feel seen, the piece began. The food is precise without being cold, inventive without being alienating. In a city full of restaurants that perform excellence, Beaumont's kitchen quietly achieves it. There was a photograph. Claudette, maybe 40, in chef's whites, standing at a prep station. She was looking not at the camera but slightly past it. The way people look when they're thinking about something other than the fact of being photographed. She looked younger and also, somehow, more tired. She also looked completely herself. Ethan read the piece twice. He put his phone down and stared at the ceiling for a long time. He told Priya the next morning. Priya read the article in the lobby, and then she sat down on the bench near the entrance trophy case and didn't say anything for almost a minute. "She just went back to cleaning," Priya said. "Yeah, she didn't say anything. She didn't tell him. She could have." "I know. Why wouldn't you?" Priya stopped. She thought about it. I guess she already knew who she was. Neither of them said anything for a while. "Do you think we should tell someone?" Ethan asked. "Tell them what?" Priya said. "That she's better than she's letting on? She knows that. It's not our story to tell." Kowalski found out on his own, the way people who've stopped paying proper attention always find out. Too late, from someone who wasn't involved. A visiting food journalist named Sandra Webb, who was in town for the spring showcase and recognized Claudette's face while waiting near the service entrance for her taxi. Sandra had interviewed Claudette in 2011. She remembered the interview clearly because it was one of the few times in her career she'd left a restaurant thinking, "This person is doing something that matters and nobody knows it yet." She'd known what happened to Beau Rivage. The industry was small and the news of Marcus's death had made its rounds. She'd wondered occasionally what had become of Claudette. She had not expected to find her here, in this building, in this uniform. She said nothing to Claudette. She wasn't sure what there was to say. But she mentioned it to the event coordinator, who mentioned it to the director of programs, who mentioned it at the faculty debrief the following Monday. Kowalski was at that debrief. He learned that the woman he'd been dismissing for 4 months had run a restaurant that had been, in certain circles, considered one of the 20 best in Toronto during its decade of operation. He learned that she'd trained under Gerard Moreau, whose name Kowalski had been dropping since culinary school. He learned that Claudette Beaumont had cooked at a level that most of his career had been in various ways aimed at reaching. He sat with this information for the duration of the debrief. He did not speak. Afterward, he went to the 3rd floor, where Claudette was cleaning the hallway outside the pastry labs. It was just after 5. The students had mostly gone. The building was quiet in the way that institutions are quiet when the people they're built for aren't inside them. Kowalski stood in the hallway and watched her work for a moment. Then he said her name. She turned. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He tried again. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for how I've spoken to you." He stopped. He was not a man who found this easy. You could see him working through it, word by word. "For how I treated you. It was wrong and I'm sorry." Claudette regarded him. She was quiet for a moment, not considering whether to accept the apology, he realized, but considering whether what he'd said was what he actually meant, or whether it was simply what the situation required him to say. He had the strange, uncomfortable sense of being evaluated with considerable precision. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate that. I didn't know." "You didn't need to know," she said gently, not letting him finish the sentence that would have made his remorse about her credentials rather than about how he'd treated a person. That wasn't the problem. He stood there. "The problem," she said, "was that it didn't occur to you to treat me decently, regardless of who I was or what I'd done. That's what you might want to think about." She said it without malice, without the satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting to say it, with the tone of a woman who'd thought about this for a long time and had simply finally been asked. Kowalski nodded slowly. He looked at the floor. He looked back up. "Fair," he said. "That's fair." He walked back down the hallway. She watched him go. Then she turned back to the wall she'd been cleaning and finished the section, moving to the next with the same unhurried attention she brought to every surface she tended. She didn't go back to professional cooking. People wondered about this afterward. Ethan, Priya, Sandra Webb, who mentioned Claudette in a piece she wrote that autumn about culinary labor and the people the industry renders invisible. They wondered if perhaps she should. If the world was worse for not having Claudette Beaumont back behind a stove somewhere. But this was, perhaps, a failure of imagination on their part. An assumption that the highest use of a great talent was its most visible expression. That a life measured in reservations and reviews and column inches was a fuller life than one measured in other ways. Claudette herself thought about it sometimes in the evenings, in her garden. She thought about Marcus and the restaurant, and the particular feeling of a sauce that came together exactly right. The satisfaction that lived in the hands and nowhere else. She thought about what she'd lost and what she'd built in its place. She thought about Farid holding the door and Paulette's laugh, and the pleasure of a floor she'd cleaned correctly. She thought, "I know what I am. I always knew." The question was never whether other people would find out. The question was whether it mattered. And she had decided, years ago, on one of the quiet evenings after Marcus, that it didn't. Not the way people assumed it did. Knowing who you are doesn't require an audience. It requires only that you know. She put down her coffee. She went back inside. She would be at work by 5:45. Farid would hold the door. There was a section of hallway on the second floor she hadn't been satisfied with yesterday, and she wanted to give it another pass. She was already thinking about how she'd do it better. "I've been thinking about Claudette ever since I first heard her story, and I keep coming back to the same question. How many people have we walked past, in hospitals, in school hallways, in parking lots, without any idea of who they truly are? How many times have we let someone's title, or the absence of one, decide for us whether they were worth our attention?" Kowalski wasn't a monster. He was just ordinary in the worst possible way. A man who'd confused credentials with worth and never thought to question it until the moment he couldn't avoid it. The lesson Claudette left behind wasn't about fighting back. It was about something harder. Staying fully yourself in a world that keeps trying to reduce you. She didn't need Kowalski to see her. She already did. If this story made you think of someone you know, or maybe someone you've underestimated, or maybe yourself, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you're new to Harmon Tales, welcome. We tell stories about the people who stay quiet until the moment it counts. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.